Okay. Good. Hi, everyone. Purim 2021, the year of the pandemic. Well, last year was the initial pandemic Purim. Who would have thought that it would have continued until this year? At least this year, we're going to try and do something at the synagogue in terms of Purim, as safe as can be. No pressure, of course. It depends on how you feel about being around people. But regardless of where you are, there are certain obligations that the rabbis suggested that we do on Purim. I'll start off by talking a little bit about those, just as a reminder to people what to do. And then I'll go into two aspects of the happiness of Purim. In a way, they're complete opposite of each other, and you can choose which one you prefer. Whenever you talk about a rabbinic festival like Purim, we're talking rabbinic law. There's nothing from the Torah about this. This happened, hundreds, it's happened 1,000 years approximately after Moses was alive. So, there's no real godly, spiritual dimensions to this festival that are real. I know that a lot of rabbis try to say things like Purim is as holy as Yom Kippurim. They mention the two names being the same. And, there's lots of different ways of trying to give importance to festivals like Hanukkah and Purim. But bottom line is, they're not in the Torah and they're not as important as the other festivals. Having said that, if you had to go ask your average Jew in wherever, United States, wherever it is, where they didn't go to Jewish school, they don't go to synagogue, which festivals do they know? Hanukkah comes up as number 1 or 2. Purim doesn't come up as much unless you're in Israel. If you're in Israel, Purim is a massive, massive festival. Street parties all night long in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem for sure. I know this firsthand because I was at them. But I'm sure the whole of Israel celebrates Purim in some shape or form. And it's a very fun day at the schools, at the elementary schools, at the high schools, etc., etc. Why is this such a famous festival? So let's start off with the obligations. There are 4 obligations that you're meant to do on Purim. In no particular order, but I'll start off with what I consider the 2 most important. First one, the reading of the Megillah, which is the telling of the story of the scroll of Esther. You're meant to read it twice on Purim, once in the evening, once in the morning. But, the assumption is that you're trying to get in touch with the history of what happened at least once reading that Megillah. And that's, a very festive time that people make a noise when they hear Haman's name, the evil person in the story, etc., etc. That's the first obligation. The second obligation is to have a feast on Purim. And the reason why I say that this is very important is that the other 2 commandments that I'm going to mention afterwards, I don't like to say commandments because to me commandments are from Hashem, but obligations that the rabbis obligated, which is, giving charity and giving gifts to your friends, all of those relate to the Sudat Purim, the meal that you have on Purim. If you go to religious people's homes on Purim, this meal is not a 1-course meal. This is a 3 to 6 course meal that goes on for hours and hours and hours. People get slightly tipsy at the meal. Some people get very drunk. The halacha says you should get so drunk to the point that you don't know the difference between blessed is Mordechai, who's the hero in the story, and cursed is Haman. Now I know for me to not know the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman, I think you actually have to inject me with 5 bottles of whiskey. Okay, I don't even think 2 bottles is going to be enough to get me to not know the difference. And I've never had 2 bottles, don't get me wrong. Okay, I've never even had 1 bottle, but I can't even picture myself not knowing the difference. That's why the rabbis of the Shulchan Aruch and the halachic commentaries say what that expression is telling you is get drunk to the point that you fall asleep. Because when you're sleeping, you don't know the difference between Haman and Mordechai. And that's what the Talmud was saying, get that drunk. It's a weird thing, in some religions, Islam, I believe, they don't drink alcohol at all. Hi, Neil, welcome. They don't drink at all. Whereas in some traditions, I think if you had to go like Ireland or something, they drink everything. Everything will be a drinking fest. In Judaism, you are allowed to drink everything in moderation. But the only time we go out of moderation when it comes to drinking is on Purim. It's the only time, at least recorded in the Shulchan Aruch. And as I said, it's only to get you to the point of getting sleepy, and you're only meant to be drinking wine. So, it's meant to be a slow process. I guess Cape Townians understand the concept of drinking wine better than others because there's so many hundreds of wineries in Cape Town. But, wine is a slow consumption getting you drunk, as opposed to a hard liquor, which you can get drunk much easier. So that is the Sudat Purim, which you're meant to have and maybe get slightly drunk. Then there is the last two obligations, which is Matanot le'evyonim, incorrectly translated as giving charity, but it's specifically giving charity to people that they can use those funds or whatever it is for their own Purim meal. That's why I said it's not as important as the Purim meal, because the Matanot le'evyonim, that charity that you're giving, if you give to Save the Whales Foundation on Purim, that is not Matanot le'evyonim. Even if you give to non-Jewish charities on Purim, that is not Matanot le'evyonim. You have done tzedakah. Tzedakah, which is general charity, you should be giving the whole year through. And it doesn't matter if you give to non-Jews or Jews, or if you give to humans or animals. There is no differentiation. As long as you're giving to someone in need, that is the mitzvah of charity, which is a very important commandment in the Torah. But the rabbis didn't obligate you in tzedakah on Purim. They obligated you in helping other Jews have a meal for Purim. And that's why, if you want to give Matanot le'evyonim, there's lots of things on Google that you can search. Donate Matanot le'evyonim, and whoever has those websites will literally be giving that money on Purim itself to Jewish people to enjoy their meal on Purim. The last one, Mishloach Manot, giving gifts to your friends, that is mentioned in the scroll of Esther itself, that the Jews, when they were saved, gave gifts to each other. And once again, this is subsumed under the Sudat Purim, because you can't give someone something that can't be used on Purim. I'm trying to think of an example, but even if you give a CD or you give a book, they can use that to enjoy their meal more by playing music in the background, or maybe taking a siesta between courses and reading a few pages. That is all okay for Mishloach Manot, but you couldn't, give your friend, donate your friend something that they're only going to receive after Purim. It has to be to increase the joy of Purim itself. So those are the 4 obligations that the rabbis obligated us in. And, each to their own how much they want to do those things. I'll start off with, 2 stories. Does anyone have a Purim story? If anyone has a Purim story, please, unmute yourself and let me know. I'll just say 1 or 2 stories before I venture into the nature of happiness on Purim, just to show you how some things that I've seen with my own eyes, which I didn't think existed, but they do. So when I was at Yeshiva University in New York City, there is a rabbi. He's a fantastic rabbi. Thank God he's still alive. I haven't spoken to him in many, many years. His name is Rabbi Meir Goldberg. And he would have at his house on Purim in New York City, he lived in my building, I would venture between 60 and 80 students. And that is a huge meal to have in a New York City apartment. And that meal went for 5 hours at least. And what amazed me about Rabbi Goldfeld at this time is he was in such a zone on Purim that he was completely oblivious to what these other raucous 60 to 80, 20 to 25-year-olds were doing. And people were literally hanging off the fans I remember, I just mentioned somebody got, you get drunk. So there were a few boys getting sick at his house, and in different ways, and he didn't flinch. It was as if those people could have done anything other than, hurting his family, but anything other than that, whether they scratched the wall or tore the couches or tore pages of his book. I saw one person tear a page of his Talmud. Now, Rabbi Goldvich's Talmud. First of all, the Talmud itself was, I would say, each book was close to 75 centimeters tall, each volume. Okay, I'm talking one of the biggest books you're ever going to see. That's how big each and every one of his, 60 volumes of Talmud was. And when you see someone tear out a page or get sick on a page or whatever it is, you know that to replace that book, it's almost like replacing, art of Monet. I don't know how many sets of those huge Gemorahs there are existing in the world. I can't imagine too many. And he had one of those sets and he did not flinch. He was that happy. So just letting you know that there are people out there who celebrate Purim as if they are in another dimension. So that was Rabbi Meir Goldvicht. Then a personal story that happened to me, and I'm going to try to link these stories. So let's start off, actually, before I tell you the second story, let's go into the first aspect of the nature of Purim's happiness. This has to do with two things. One, the commandment of Matanot le'Evyonim, and one to do with the last verse in the scroll of Esther. The last verse ends off, the whole story's happened and the Jews have been saved in Persia, the war has happened, Haman and his sons have been hanged, and it ends off by saying, King Achashverosh imposed a tax on those within his kingdom. Unbelievable. As if nothing to do with the story of the Jews or anything. Ends up by saying King Achashverosh imposes a tax. It's kind of like what's going on now with ESCOM and other, everyone's trying to impose more funds, more taxes. We bought the wrong vaccine, let's tax everyone else, etc., to get more money for whatever it is. Now, governments do this all the time. But what's irregular is that the scroll of Esther mentions that. It's got nothing to do with the story. The story is already finished. Why does it end off with that? That's the question. Second question is, Matanot le'Evyonim, giving gifts. So what's the deal with giving gifts on Purim? And what's the deal with giving charity on Purim? So we don't have a special commandment of giving charity on Hanukkah. We're not allowed to give charity on any of the other festivals from the Torah festivals because we're not meant to be handing money or working. But on Hanukkah, which is not a Torah festival and you're allowed to work, we don't give charity necessarily on Hanukkah to try and give other people, latkes or, whatever people eat on Hanukkah. We don't do that. I mean, you can invite people to your house, gesundheit, fantastic. But you don't have an obligation to give people money so that they can have their own Hanukkah meals. But on Purim, you do. Why is that different? So a few quotes about this. Number one, the Shulchan Aruch, the book of Jewish law, says, we don't investigate on Purim who is poor and who is not. Rather, we give to whoever stretches out their hand. Now, this is, in South Africa, this is a very tricky question that all of us have to deal with, I'm sure, all the time. Me, almost on a daily level, at the amount of people who knock on our door. But it's always a question of who do you give charity to? Do you give charity to beggars who are children? Do you give beggars, charity to people who look like they're going to use it for drugs? Do you give charity to people who look, they're wearing Nike sneakers? They don't even look like they're poor, but they're claiming that they don't have anything. How do you measure? So the rest of the year, the book of, the Shulchan Aruch is assuming that you should look into who you're giving. Don't be irresponsible and give people who are going to abuse that money that you're giving. And yes, you have to be responsible for who you're giving. When I lived in South Africa 20 years ago, I don't know if the law is still the same, but they used to have a law in Johannesburg that you shouldn't give charity to, women who have little children who are acting as part of the mother trying to get charity. I can't remember who it was. Was it the city? Was it the mayor? But someone came on, maybe it was just the newspapers, but somebody said at some point, I remember this clearly, said you should not be giving charity to people on the sides of the streets if they have young children with them. And this was to promote that young children don't stay with their mothers all day begging, because the mothers were getting more money from having their little children with them. So they were taking their kids out of school or wherever they were and bringing them to beg. That is a bad thing, to be giving charity to people who are going to abuse that charity. It's not necessarily, I wouldn't label it a bad thing, but it's not a responsible thing. There's better ways to do it. But on Purim comes along the Shulchan Aruch, and it says that you should not differentiate. Don't investigate who's doing what with what. Give money to whoever comes and asks you for money. That is also a little bit strange. The Ritva, on the famous commentary on the Talmud, gives the answer for this. He says, and I'm quoting, "This day is not of tzedakah alone. It is not of regular giving charity, but it is of joy and gifts." We are meant to be sharing our joy with others. It's a weird thing that the Ritva say, that yes, if you want to be a good person, you should be sharing your joy with other people all the time. But you've got a commandment to be joyful, but you don't have a commandment to make everybody else joyful as well. Even if you look in the Torah, it doesn't really say anywhere you should be happy. But the assumption is that you need to be happy in order to do all the other things. The only time it mentions that I'm aware of with happiness is what to do with the festivals. It says, "V'samachta b'chagecha," you shall be happy on the festivals. And there's another expression when it comes with the curses, where it says, because you didn't serve me with a full heart of happiness, you will be cursed. Da, 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 da. So there it's in the negative, but nowhere that I know of that I can remember does it say specifically in the Torah, you have a commandment to be happy. But yes, there's an underlying principle that in order to do all the other things, you need to be happy. But how do you know that you have to make everybody else happy as well? Well, that's a gray area where some people are introverts, some people are extroverts, some people don't like having other people in their lives. How can you criticize someone who just prefers being alone? That's why they only have the obligation to be happy on their own. But on Purim, there is a suggestion that you have to make everybody else happy. This is Rabbi Meir Goldfeld. Bring everyone to his house, no matter what they do, no matter how sick they get, no matter what they break, no matter what they tear, no matter how much paint is chipped off the wall. He was prepared to make people happy on Purim. That was the level of intensity that he saw Purim as. And I'll just finish off this point with a quote from Maimonides in his Laws of Purim. Maimonides quote, "It is better to give more to the poor." So he's talking about on Purim. "It's better to give more to the poor than on having a lavish meal yourself or giving gifts to your friends. For there is no greater joy than to gladden the hearts of the poor, orphans, widows, and converts. For those who gladden them resemble the divine presence, the Shekhinah, as Hashem revives the spirit of the lowly and revives those with broken hearts." Unbelievable. Maimonides is saying, yes, of course, you should be giving charity. But the more happiness and joy that you create on Purim, the better. That's why he says you should give more money to Matanot LeEvyonim, because when you help out the widow and the orphan, they get greater joy than your friends do. And it's all about creating as much joy as possible. It's almost like sharing the joy with others, enabling others to be joyful. And I find that that is what Purim, that's one aspect of what Purim represents to me more than any other festival. Yes, there are festivals like Pesach where you invite your family. And I'd say Rosh Hashanah as well is very family oriented. And Hanukkah is very also family oriented and maybe friends oriented. You know, you have Hanukkah parties every night and you see friends. But Purim is the one festival that is much farther reaching than that. It's trying to create a general experience in the whole community of everyone being happy. And that's maybe where the rabbis came from when they established Purim as a festival more than other times, because it was the whole Jewish community under threat. It wasn't these people, it wasn't the Ashkenazim in Eastern Europe like the Holocaust, where most of the Sephardi Jews were saved. It was the whole Jewish community living in Persia or living under Persian rule. And everybody should be thankful, and you should help other people being happy and thankful by doing these obligations. So that is Rambam and the Ritva trying to show that the mitzvah of giving matanot le'evyonim, which is unique type of charity where you don't differentiate who deserves and who doesn't, is trying to say it's about making joy. And that's why even if the person doesn't deserve money because they have money, but if they're asking you, you still give them because they also need to be happy. And that's what Purim is about. So it's communal happiness. That's point one. The nature of happiness on Purim is much more of a communal happiness than your own individual happiness. Second nature, so that was Rabbi Meir Goldberg's story, and that's how it related to the nature of happiness, communal. Now I'll go to another one, which is fake it until you make it happiness. So this story happened to me myself in my first year in yeshiva in the year 1998 in Jerusalem, where a very unfortunate occurrence happened to me, but it was more unfortunate to the person that I bumped into. I went to a yeshiva in Jerusalem called Eisha Torah, where my brother was learning at the time, for Purim. And it was a huge party. And there was dancing, and there was drinking, and there was everything that you can imagine a Purim party to be. And whoever's been to a Jewish wedding knows that there's this one dance that a man holds another man with their arms like this and goes around in a circle. And, you know, sometimes people go flying, but most times people hold each other until they get dizzy, and that's the end of that dance. But I was doing it with a friend of mine. And a rabbi from Eisha Torah, from that yeshiva that I was there were hundreds of people. And everybody was dancing in a circle. And I was, you know, in cloud number 9. It was my first Purim in Israel. And I was loving it. And I was with friends. And my brother was there. I was even with family. And as we were doing that circle, I collided with a rabbi from Eisha Torah. He was a young rabbi. I mean, I was 17 or 18, and he was maybe 30. But we collided with such a force, and it just so happened the way that our bodies hit is I was fine, but he went flying. Like I've never seen someone fly before, almost in slow motion. And he hit his head on the floor and immediately fainted. Immediately, boom, fainted. And I looked at him, are you okay? Okay. And you know, the paramedics came in, it's everyone. And I, for the rest of that Purim, I felt so bad. And obviously it wasn't my fault, and I didn't see the person, and someone was throwing me into him. So it wasn't my fault. It was a complete accident. But for the rest of that Purim, it was very difficult for me to be happy because I was feeling this Jewish guilt of knocking out my first rabbi, first and only in my life. You know, cold. I don't know what happened to this rabbi since then, but whenever I used to visit my brother at the yeshiva, I kind of like used to hide. Hopefully he doesn't recognize me, etc., etc. But that was, you know, a hard thing. How do you be happy when you don't feel it? And that is also what Purim represents. And I'll give you some sources about that. When it comes to the laws of drinking in general, on festivals, this is, you know, on Passover, even though we're drinking 4 cups of wine on Passover, but this still applies to those 4 cups, as well as on Sukkot, as well as on Rosh Hashanah, on Shavuot, etc. Maimonides, when one eats and drinks on a festival, this is his quote, don't overindulge in wine or frivolity, saying to yourself that I'm expanding the happiness of the day. Don't tell yourself in your mind, yeah, I'm drinking because I'm doing it in honor of Passover, or I'm doing it in honor of Shavuot. I love Shavuot, so I'm drinking. Maimonides is saying, don't do that. It is impossible to serve God through frivolity, lightheadedness, or drunkenness. So that's Maimonides, very Muslim of him. He did live in a Muslim country, okay? Very Muslim of him to limit the amount of alcohol that you drink, even on the Jewish festivals, which, the Talmud says, how should you celebrate the festivals? With wine and meat, That's the way that the Talmud says it, assuming that you like meat and assuming that you like wine. But he limits that, and he says you shouldn't be lightheaded, you shouldn't be frivolous, you shouldn't be drunk. That's not the way of celebrating the festivals. He's assuming that festivals are very spiritual entities. You should be meditative on the festival. You should be deeply yearning for God and for the symbolism of what that festival is. That's why you shouldn't be getting drunk. Whereas on Passover, even Maimonides has to recognize that there is an obligation to drink. Not only that, to drink until you don't know the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. That's a lot. So how does Maimonides render both of them to make sense? So Rabbi Soloveitchik, who used to be a master in Maimonides, he speaks out for Maimonides and he explains. This is his quote about Passover. You're going to be shocked at what Rabbi Soloveitchik says. You think he thought Purim was such an amazing festival? Not at all. Listen to the words of Rabbi Soloveitchik from his book, Days of Deliverance. It has nothing, Purim, let me start off. Purim has nothing to do with a feeling of tranquility, serenity, and peace of mind, like the other festivals that he was talking about. It is not an inner experience. It is more active, acting as if I were happy. Sometimes we see people acting happy, but they are not. They deceive themselves and deceive others and somehow give the impression as if they are happy, but they are really depressed and unhappy. This concept of happiness was introduced for Purim. Rabbi Soloveitchik is saying that Purim was introduced for the people who aren't so happy, so that there's one day that they should fake that they're happy. There's an expression, fake it until you make it. So Rabbi Soloveitchik, the way that I'm understanding him and the way that other rabbis have understood him on the YU website that I was reading, is that Purim is not so much about this inner feeling that Rabbi Meir Goldbeck seemed to suggest to the world, that there's this overall joy of community, which is greater than my own individual joy. And it's like Yom Kippurim, and there's atonement. And you can take that version of Purim for sure. But the Maimonides / Rabbi Soloveitchik version of Purim was the opposite. It was limiting Purim and saying Purim is not this very spiritual entity that requires a lot of, peace of mind and tranquility. No, it's an external festival. It's a festival that you drink, that you get slightly tipsy, that you eat well, that you give gifts of food to your friends. Why? Because not all of us are happy all the time. And everybody deserves that little taste of pushing yourself to be happy. And I would just say one other quote that he has about this. This is Rabbi Soloveitchik explaining why we don't say Hallel on Purim. Because every other festival we say this prayer of Hallel, of praise. It's a special Thanksgiving prayer, whereas on Purim we do not. So he's asking, why don't we? There was no sense of security back then. the miracle was incomplete. There was salvation, Yeshua, Yeshua, the word for salvation in Hebrew. There was Yeshua. The Jews did get saved, but there was no Geula. There was no long-lasting redemption. It was impermanent. No one could guarantee that the next day the same story wouldn't repeat itself. That is why there is no halal. And Rabbi Soloveitchik, my understanding of what Rabbi Soloveitchik's gearing at is that, yes, Purim, we force ourselves to drink. We force ourselves to rejoice, because if you always give yourself excuses that I'm depressed, I'm not in a position to be happy, I can't invite people over because I'm not feeling it, I'm not feeling, the feeling of having one, you might never get there. It might take years for a person to get out of their depression. It might take decades for a person to deal with certain issues. So Rabbi Soloveitchik is saying Purim is that reminder. Go out and rejoice. The rest of the people of your nation survived. They're rejoicing. Do it for them. If it's not for yourself, do it for them. Fake it until you make it. And I do believe that this is a double-edged sword, this expression of fake it until you make it. The psychologists have different opinions about this. I'll just quote you from cognitiontoday.com and psychologytoday.com, and then I'll end. In psychologytoday.com, it quotes a journal of consumer research that says that ambitious professionals who try to wear luxury clothing to show that they're very successful professionals, so they wear a very fancy jewelry, etc., or MBA students who try to wear Rolex watches to pretend that they're so rich because they're trying to prove to everyone else in the course that they've done so well. Those people, their fake it until they make it does not work. According to psychologytoday.com, that's a false form of fake it until you make it, because those external things of trying to show how rich you are or how successful you are ends up in people having less self-esteem than what they started off before they wore that stuff. So there is a fake it or you make it, which is negative. But then there is another side, which is positive. And this Psychology Today mentions, and I'm quoting you, I like the quote that they said. They said, make sure you're interested in changing yourself on the inside, not simply trying to change other people's perceptions of you. So if you're faking it until you make it for other people's perspectives, to try and increase your self-esteem in their eyes, it probably won't work. But if you fake it until you make it yourself, because you know that you're trying to increase your happiness or increase your confidence or increase your whatever it is that you're trying to increase, and you know that you're not so good in that area, you know that you're a little bit depressed or that you're a little bit anxious, a little that, so you know what, you're a little bit anxious, tell yourself, look at yourself in the mirror and say, I can do it. I'm confident. I'm confident. Look at yourself 3 times in the mirror. I'm confident, even though you're not. And go out to that nightclub and go speak to that girl or whatever it is that you need to do. And you'll be surprised at the success that you'll have from just pushing yourself. So that's the fake it until you make it response. That sometimes if your motivation is pure, that you're trying to increase your own inner experience of yourself in some way, as opposed to just trying to make yourself look better in the eyes of others, the fake it and you make it approach can actually help. I'll end off with the cognitiontoday.com. They bring a neuroscience principle called the Hebbian principle. And this has to do with the signals that neurons and neurotransmitters make in the brain. And pretty much the Hebbian principle says this, that if you work on one thing in your brain, but you associate it with another, even though there's no real association there naturally, but if you cognitively associate them in some ways, if you do it enough, those associations become permanent. And for an example, If you're a bad driver, but you keep telling yourself that you're a good driver, it might start making neurons in your brain that make you into a better driver mechanic. And this is a Hebbian principle that the neuroscientists are going into. So that fake it until you make it actually can have science behind it in your brain. So there is something about that principle of fake it until you make it. So in summary, we started off by learning the 4 obligations that the rabbi said. There were very fishy things about those obligations. Why are you giving gifts to your friends? Why do you have to give charity on Purim itself and not on Chanukah? Why are you giving charity where you're not differentiating between who you're giving? Even if the person's rich and he asks you for something, it's still matanot levinim. Even if the person, isn't deserving, they're wearing, a Rolex watch, but they ask you, you give. Why is that? So the Ritva and the Rambam seems to suggest that it's not about the charity, because charity is a commandment every other day, but it's about increasing the joy and sharing your joy with the world, because Purim is about a communal gift of charity that God gave the whole of the Jewish people by saving them, not to individuals. And there is something in going to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv and seeing a society doing Purim where everybody's trying to make everyone else happy. I remember when I was in Purim, we went to the old age home in Israel, all dressed up in costumes and try to make them happy. And yes, that's what Israel's about. You'll see that with your own eyes if you go there on Purim, how much on a national level people are making each other happy, and it's hard not to be happy on Purim in Israel. That was the first point, and that was Rabbi Meir Goldwich of just, being okay with whatever people do in his house on Purim. I don't know how he did it. I don't know what his wife was thinking. That's a whole other story. But he somehow managed to just keep his cool with people hanging from his fans because he just wanted to make other people happy. And then the second idea was not just about, it's kind of opposite. Not that the happiness is so great, but the happiness is limited. Rabbi Soloveitchik and the Rambam's version of, yes, you're meant to get drunk, but it's not a lasting drunkenness. It's just a temporary happiness. And really, there is no real big deal about beating Haman where another Haman could come tomorrow. But you have to take what you can get. So, there's no use in not being happy because you can't have everything. Be happy with the little that you are given. And that was Rabbi Soloveitchik's version of what Purim is. It's an external happiness that you got to fake the happiness, even though you might not have the home that you want, and you might not have the job that you want, and you might not have the family that you want, and the this that you want, and that you want, but fake it until you make it. And the alcohol helps with that because you deserve it. Everybody deserves to feel a little bit of happiness, and it might even help your brain if you fake it, make it real the next time. Those are 2 messages from Purim, 5781, 2021. We won't be drinking together because we'll be wearing masks, but we will be saying L'chaim in our minds through telepathy. Thank you, everyone, and see you soon, hopefully.